And we live in a world that calls it a choice and a right, but doesn't realize that many women identify feeling pressured or coerced into their abortion. And so that was my birth mother's experience. Not only was it not her choice, but she wasn't just coerced, she was literally forced against her will to have this saline infusion abortion. You know, here she was, a 19-year-old college student, and the very people who should have loved her, supported her, provided her true choices and support were responsible for making sure the only choice was the door that led to St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. She was not married to my biological father. And from what I've been told, that was just not convenient for her parents at the time because of their status in the community. And, you know, it's unfortunate because that still happens today. You know, very well-intentioned friends and family members and medical professionals and clergy can be responsible for coercing or forcing women to have abortions under circumstances like my birth mother's.
Right. And so the saline infusion abortion that you're talking about, explain what type of abortion that is, what happens in that type of abortion.
Yeah, that procedure was the most common abortion procedure performed back in the 1970s, and it involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding the preborn baby in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to then poison and scald the child to death. So typically procedure lasted about 72 hours. If the child was, as we would say, fortunate enough, their life was ended within the first 24 hours, and then they spent the next couple of days inducing labor with the intent of the deceased child being expelled from the womb. We actually know through my medical records that I didn't soak in the toxic salt solution for 24 hours or 3 days. I actually soaked in it for 5.
Whoa.
They just kept trying time and again to induce my birth mother's labor, and I was just not budging. And so here I soaked in that toxic salt solution for even longer than the standards of the procedure. You know, in my medical records, it even indicates they estimated my birth mother to be about 18 to 20 weeks pregnant. But the fact that I was ultimately born alive on the 5th day and I weighed almost 3 pounds tells the medical professionals that she was much further along. And in a little tiny corner of my medical records, it actually says I was probably about 31 weeks.
Oh my gosh. And so that moment, you're born alive. Explain what's going on in what you know now. What happened in that doctor's office or in the hospital when you're born alive, and then your grandmother actually tried to what? Explain what happened.
Yeah, it's interesting having a story like this. Sometimes people will go, that can't happen. That doesn't happen. Well, it's happened to me, and I know it happens to children still today. So here they induced my birth mother's labor finally on the 5th day of the abortion procedure, believing that I would be delivered as a successful abortion. And that's the day that I was accidentally born alive. You have a birthday, right?
Right.
I have a day that I was accidentally born alive.
Wow.
That I now celebrate as my birthday. And there's something really different about that. The gravity of that is not lost on me. And I wish I could say, Alex, that when I was accidentally born alive in the final step of that abortion procedure, that all the medical professionals just jumped in and saw my dignity and value and provided me medical care. But everything we've heard from people like Governor Ralph Northam of Virginia about infanticide are very much true. I now know that I was laid aside for a period of time while there were arguments about whether I would be provided medical care. You can tell by looking at my medical records that within about 5 minutes, I was nearly dead. And we know at that hospital, children could ultimately wind up in the utility closet where they were placed in buckets of formaldehyde and left to die. As far as we know, I never made it to that closet, but I was laid aside. And the very person who told other nurses to leave me to die was my grandmother, as you started to connect to. And I was told initially that it was my abortionist who gave that demand, but now I know that it was my grandmother. She was a prominent nurse, oversaw the education of many of the nurses that even worked at that hospital. That's how she was able to force the abortion upon my birth mother. You know, she knew the ins and outs of that hospital. She had a lot of experience. She had a connection with the abortionist who worked there.
Wow.
And so she forced the abortion, monitored it at the hospital throughout those 5 days, coming face to face with me. I was her firstborn grandchild. She told the other nurses to leave me to die.
And when they didn't let you die, Did your grandmother know that you had been saved?
Yeah, this is where it makes one of those Hollywood turns, right? Here I am nearly dead. There's arguments about whether I'll be provided medical care. And ultimately, we now know one nurse in particular rushed me off to the NICU. I was born alive at a hospital. Most late-term abortions take place at hospitals, not because they intend to save children like me, but because of the greater risk to a woman's health that far along in a pregnancy for an abortion. But I was blessed that it was at a hospital because here this nurse rushed me off to the NICU, believing that if other people found out that the abortion had failed and a little girl had lived, that maybe they could provide medical care that would sustain my life. I know that because a nurse reached out to me after my first book came out. She was a nurse working in the NICU that day who was there when everything was happening. And she remembers all of the crazy things the nurse was saying about how the abortionist messed up. But ultimately, my grandmother followed her in. I didn't know that until just a few years ago. And I now know that my grandmother told all of those nurses to never tell my biological mother that I had survived that abortion.
So your biological mother, who was how old at the time?
19.
She was 19. She had no idea that abortion had failed?
Correct.
So what happens in the minutes and even the days after you're born?
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? So my birth mother was told that day, the abortion has been successful. It's hideous. It's a monster. Don't look at it. As I was in the room, she didn't know, Alex, if I was a little boy or a little girl. And so here she's in this devastating pain, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and then has to leave the hospital trying to pick up the pieces of her life, which, like so many women in that position, she spent decades then with incredible regret and suffering. And so here she tries to lead a normal life, and her family keeps the secret of the abortion failing and me being placed for adoption. So while that is happening in her life, my life is really starting at that hospital.
So then your grandma did know that you had survived.
Oh, yeah.
So how did she find out? When did they tell her, oh, by the way?
Oops.
Yeah.
We can joke about that. It's okay. My life is full of a few moments where you can just go, wow, we really need to laugh about that now. Yeah, my birth mother didn't know that I had survived until I was about 30 years old.
Oh my gosh, this whole time she thought you were dead?
Mm-hmm.
Who told her that you were alive? Was it you?
Was it you? It was, sort of. I mean, in a roundabout way. I
might be skipping in your story, so if I am, tell me.
It's okay. We'll connect the dots together. When I started speaking in 2007 and sharing my story, I had tried to find my biological mother before that because I wanted my birth parents to hear from me before I ever showed up on a show like this, and they kind of were traumatized by it. And I never could have realized that there was really no way people would tell her the truth. And so I had a little bit of contact with her family, and they made it clear that my messages to her would not be passed along. And I felt like I still needed to come out and share this story with the world. And so here I didn't realize as I was starting to speak out in defense of life that my birth mother's family would ultimately see me on a TV show. I've never named names until I really got my birth mother's blessing in recent years, but I didn't even have to name a name because they knew I look identical to my biological father. And just from the very details of the abortion procedure and where I was born alive, they knew that it was me. And so that's how my birth mother found out. They saw me on TV, and I suspect they kind of panicked a little bit, and they finally told her that I was alive.
Hey, if you saw that and you're like, whoa, I've never heard any other conservative podcast like this, well, you'd be right. That's why you need to go subscribe to the Politics YouTube channel for more episodes of The Spillover.